So the Rural Museums Network is a registered charity for rural life collections everywhere and the people who look after them. In addition to events and activities such as this, we have a web-based discussion group, which is a really great place to exchange information and to look for answers. We've got a really great collective knowledge and experience of people within our membership. Before I introduce you today to Jeremy, who's going to be doing our seminar, just to let you know that although this is the last of the ones at the beginning of this year, we'll be having quite a few more at the end of the year. And at the moment, the topics include conservation of large objects and a discussion on sustainability within rural museums. So do look out for those. They'll be after the summer. For those of you who are members, we also run monthly informal during the cuz sessions. So this is where people can just come and chat, talk about problems they may be having or projects they've got coming up. On Wednesday, the 22nd of June, in the morning at 10:30, we'll be celebrating Gypsy Roma Traveller History Month, where we'll be joined by Cathy Townsley-McGuigan from Auchendrane Township in Argyll, and she'll be talking to us about putting up a bow tent, and you can ask her any questions you have. So if you're not a member, you can head to our website. It can be as little as £10 a year, and you can get all of those things for free after that. If you've got any questions for Jeremy throughout this, please just put them into the chat. At the end of Jeremy speaking, I'll ask you to unmute and you can ask your questions yourselves. So yeah, just put them into chat if you've got any questions. So with all that done, Jeremy, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. I shall screen share. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about something which I've been working on now with the company of people who know a lot more than me and have much deeper roots for many years. And that's a question about how do we represent Gypsy history if we're in really the public forum. I'm thinking not just of what do we do in museum cases, what do we do on open days, but how do we talk about a community who have not historically had great opportunities to talk for themselves. In a way, a lot of the spade work for this has been done for us, because in social theory, in radical history, in cultural studies, people are pushing the post-colonial approach. And there's lots of stuff there you can cheat from, or can you? Gypsies were not colonized. I'm using gypsy here in the standard English lexicon for English Roman Natal Gypsy, member of the wider Romany diaspora. Gypsies are not subaltern. Gypsies are not a subject people. There has been no desire on the part of the host community that gypsies should be subordinate. In fact, the main desire of the host community has been that gypsies should not be, full stop. See current news bulletins if not believing yours truly. And the second part of that is, well, it's no good for the community to be, but it's great for the community to have been. So we find ourselves wrestling, I think, with nostalgia more than we might with other topics in rural history. We're also wrestling with different ways of writing the gypsy experience by people who know what they're talking about and know how to do it. And I was fascinated when I was kind of putting stuff together for this to pull down off my bookshelf two books which seem to me to epitomize the great gap which exists between an external and an internal projection of the history of the community. On the left, you got David Cressey's Gypsies. David Cressey is an early modern historian by training, has done some brilliant work, has turned highly trained lens of documentary analysis to the community, and has written a book on gypsies in England from the arrival in 1515 right up until the present. On the right-hand side, the somewhat less well-known outside gypsy circles feature of Peter Ingram, enormously respected in circles. There is nothing that Uncle Peter cannot do, including dancing the broom dance at the age of 70. He knows every craft. He has restored, built, written histories of wagons. In his book, is couched in the form of a novel. It's one of those wonderful roman clef in which two gypsy kids, Jimmy and Katie, are taken in by their old grandfather. And of course, old John is simply Peter himself put on the page. And every aspect of life is laid down for you. You know at the end of it exactly how to put up bow tent, bender tent in the south. You know how to manage, getting a horse up the hill with a wagon without it jackknifing. You know all the crafts. It's got life in it. but yet to read David Cressey, equally talented, you feel it's a bit like those colouring sheets I used to hand out at open days. There's a wagon and there's a cob, but they're all in outline. There's no colouring to them. And rather sadly, at the end, David Cressey confesses, well, you know, I would love to have written more ethnography, but it's not in my sources. So some of the things I want to talk about is how, given the very difficult nature of the sources, again, a lot of this is going to be Surrey based because that's where I'm from, but anywhere in the country and dealing with all the traveller communities, how do we pull out a life of the people from sources that are frequently with anything else in mind? For instance, you can look at this picture in two directions. In one, it's a page from an evangelical newsfeed called the British Workmen, designed for the cultivation of the London working classes and to get them in touch with Christianity. From another perspective, in 1863, this is our first portrayal of an extended gypsy family. That's Thomas Hearn in the middle. At the age of 90, still chair bottoming like a good one, and surrounded by what is apparently only a small selection of his 50 children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom, despite the rather idyllic woodland background, lived at the Kensington Potteries, which to outsiders was not idyllic in the slightest. Again, this is a difference between the internal and the external approach. He did actually, he went to chapel and was a teetotaler and all sorts of things that qualified you for appearing in an evangelical journal. I'm not entirely sure that the extended family had quite such a commitment to that. What they did have a commitment was being portrayed. And the reason why everybody, obviously you can see it's been worked up from separate pictures, has been put into that family grouping, is they know perfectly well they're all going to buy a copy of the British Workman, which none of them can read. And they're going to pin it up because it's got the group picture. So is that a portrayal? Yes, it's got to be because it's been marketed to them. And yet if you approach it with a mindset of anyone who does Victorian studies, you're going to scream Orientalism because all of them have been portrayed as the classic dark-faced, black-haired gypsy. And there's been, you know, the whole raft of books. There are more books written about the Victorians' perception of the gypsy than about gypsies' perception of themselves or anything else. In fact, when we make the boundary change from sketches in the late 19th century to photographs, we realise that in the lineage of the Hearns, this is all perfectly accurate. They had got the Corley rat, the black blood in them. They looked like the old Roma, as very few English gypsies, of course, do. So you're looking here at what turns out to be a far more reliable presentation than you might think if you simply went at it with a mindset attuned to the traditional historian's model of, oh, I must weed out all the bad sources and what will be left. If you weed out the bad sources for gypsy history, there isn't going to be anything left. You've got to take sources as they were created and as you can use them, not necessarily as they were perceived. This is, you know, this is a double perception. On your left is Daphne Vincent, and on the right she's pointed to Daphne Vincent several years earlier. Because this was an exhibition of the work of Tony Boxall. Now, Tony was very, very good photographer. In fact, you can see his stuff is on all the picture libraries, and he was a commercial, and the family are still marketing a lot of these images. I think that that one in the middle of Daphne's mother, Louisa, that's very frequently, you know, picked up and used in gypsy books. And the reason why you've got these images is twofold. One is that Daphne's dad, Jim, who was a great horseman, horse dealer, up until the 50s, making a good living. This came to the end of what we call wagon time. It was the point at which suddenly you couldn't get your horse shod, they wouldn't accept it, gypsies weren't welcome in the forge, you couldn't get new wheels put on, you broke a spoke on the wagon, you had to put on tires because that was the only thing available. The bottom fell out of it as well, literally. In fact, the wagon in that middle picture, the bottom fell out of it in the late 60s. But before that time, he'd actually been taking the trolley along the road. The leather had gone. He was actually using a bit of rope for a bridle. The horse was a bit uncontrolled. Tony was going past, caught the eye, and pulled out his camera and went snappity snap. And Jim told him where he could put his camera in. Exciting detail. And that was like the end of it, another dinner there on the road. Except that Tony turned up the next day, tracked Jim down at the site and said, look, I'm sorry, mate, shouldn't have done that, have a woodbine. And grudgingly, they kind of looked at each other. And Jim said, well, look, I'll take a proper photo of you now, which is like the classic family lineup, a bit like the Hearns updated. But then slowly he got to know them, hung around, sitting down, and took photos of the life all around them as it was lived. So there are some wonderful character shots. There are all these shots of how the crafts are done. Louise is making the wooden flowers in that picture there. And just at the moment when it went wrong, Tony put an exhibition on, and the exhibition itself brought attention. I think it was the death of the horse that had done it for them. And in fact, the good people at Dorking, where they were stocking at the time, actually put up a fund that was going to pay not for a new horse, but to retire the old one to a horse sanctuary, because they were so sad about the thought of him going to the knacker's yard. They weren't desperately sad for Jim and Louise and Jimmy and Louisa and Jamie and Valentine and Daphne, the gypsies, but Dobbin the gypsy horse was saved. There's a happy ending. So you can see that you've got agendas being brought to the depiction of gypsies, which are not necessarily those that people would choose to have for themselves. Yet at the same time, reality has a way of subverting the outside gaze, as we know in a lot of other histories. This is done for the Illustrated London News, 1874, Latimer Road, not too far from Kensington Potteries. So we're still in the kind of Wandsworth area of London. And it's a yard, which is one of those little triangular, usually corners of land, where the railway had sliced something off. You couldn't sell it for houses, but you could pull a couple of wagons on. You can see this is early because there's chairs and tables where later on you'd actually have benches and stuff built into it. So this is one of the early, and yet the vehicle itself has obviously been looked after and cared for. That far is looked after. The children are actually, for Victorian period, in quite good quality clothing. I love the way that, you know, the sketcher has been given a brief to do a portrait of some miserable gypsies, which will, you know, encourage the pity and piety of the Victorians. So he's got the bent broken chair, and you're like going, these people were chair bottomers. That's trade. That's not ruin. And you look at the nice quality bedding on, you know, the valance and everything. This is actually, given or take the fact that it's had a few cracks on its way along the road, this is actually quite a quality vehicle. But what matters to the people in the picture, if we can, you know, take the dangerous step of speaking to them, and I think with the aid of what we know from later stories, we can. The material culture is not a big thing. The whole point about a wagon, people buy a house and they live in a house and they keep that house. Yeah, you get a wagon, but you chop it or you sell it or you move it on. It's an item of kit. It's a piece of portable property, which also has the advantage of keeping you dry. It's not a core of your identity. Keeping it clean is, keeping it warm is, but the core identity is the respect that the children in that picture have for each other. And you can see this when you move to exactly the same area 150 years later, because Wortley Street, which is the surviving run of 5 or 6 houses out of a whole set of 4 or 5 streets, was the region in Wandsworth, which was essentially gypsy colonised. The Lord of the Manor of Wandsworth Common decided in 1871 that the gypsies were not an ornament to Wandsworth Common, which might have been contested, but he moved everybody off. And just at that time, they were developing an area next to the glue works. So John Penfold bought up all the land and developed it. And then for years and years afterwards, the Penfolds and the Hildens and the Jesses and the Grimbles lived in each other's pockets and intermarried and created a cohesive community in that small stretch of land, and of course all worked together, because this is South London, so you didn't have to go far, you didn't even have to travel. You could go and work the streets of Battersea and Wandsworth. And this is only now just starting to be recognised. There's going to be a plaque put up, unveiled by people who actually grew up in what has now been annihilated almost as a community. And yet it's the perceptions which are so different. The people who lived there, it was a network of people. Everybody, you know, the kids in and out of each other's houses, people trusted each other, you all left your doors open. To the outsiders, and it features in Charles Booth's Survey of London as one of the black streets, lowest possible level of the social scale, a place where the policemen go in pairs. And like, that's why people felt so secure. The gabbers went in pairs there. You weren't at risk from them. Different sources, different perceptions. But at the same time, when you're talking about material which is produced for a public, you can have the perceptions working, if you like, in parallel. I picked this up as a postcard. It's taken near the Devil's Punch Bowl, off the main Surrey road running down into Sussex, a very popular stopping place as people were heading up and down. And this is, a family have stopped with their wagon. What I love about this is not only, yes, they've agreed to be photographed, but they obviously know perfectly well how to be photographed. Look at the way that the family have lined up. The dad is taking care of the horse. Mum's holding the long dog to make sure that he doesn't spoil the shot by moving. And also look at the quality of that wagon. I mean, I know it's black and white, but you can see the shininess. Look at the hubs on those wheels. Yes, the outer rim there, the sun's reflecting off the brass, which has obviously been polished. The next rings in on the hub are gleaming, not because they're brass, but because they're paint. This has been painted up probably in April, May, for the beginning of the Great Exodus from London. And that is a quality vehicle, and they are showing it off. And you realise when you look at this kind of picture that gypsies, more so, I think, than most branches of the Victorian working class, were happy with photography. And one reason for this is that a lot of people were actually running photographic studios themselves. There were gypsy-run photograph centres at Ascot, at Epsom, but also in order to pass down images, they would make sure that they had their photographs carried with them, because there is, there's no wall, as it were. There's no way you can hang stuff. You carry all of this. Old photos are still coming out in their hundreds, still being recorded. And photos that were taken by Shaw of the Gypsy Law Society are still in crinkled and folded form, handed here. People sort of pull these out and go, look, it's my great-great-great-granny. Not many people in the wider community know who their great-great-great-grandparents are. And you look at it and you go, that's absolutely wonderful. You try to tactfully point out you can actually get it online without the crinkles, because that would spoil the point. The same point about the wagons is that, yes, they are an investment, but they're also status. So much so that today you can have the wagon status without the inconvenience of having to go and buy one. This is a stall that was run on Epsom Downs in the Derby. Still running, I think. It's done it for a couple of years. This is 2018 I went up and got a shot of it. What I love is the bit where it says, no need to dress up. And to anyone, who meets up at the Derby every year, the irony of that, when the whole point of taking the children, the babies, most of all, is that they are dressed up to the nines, because how else do you show that you've had a good year and you're showing off? So the wagon as a prestige object is only a logical extension of the wagon as a functional item, both of use and of trade. It's not just an artifact. It's not just a large object in need of conservation. It's a statement about who you are. And it's also one that crosses over. The use of these items as prestige statements, but also not, prestige sounds a little bit too kind of competitive. You've got to carry something in your heart that tells you who you are. And this is part of that cluster of icons that means you don't forget. So you can be in a mobile home. You can have gone into brick, but once a year you go to the Derby and you reconnect with the ancestors. Or you can go to somewhere like Gordon Boswell's museum in Spalding. Gordon, God rest his soul, no longer with us, but built it up absolutely from scratch. And it has huge numbers of these little model wagons. I mean, in some ways they're great because they illustrate to you. You've got a Burton in the middle there on the right-hand side, you've got a bow top, you've got the typology. So some people have actually made the entire sequence of all the different ones there are. He's accumulated a lot of them because they were a very favourite activity. The sad thing about them, when you kind of start looking into the individual stories, generally speaking, the effect, I mean, obviously there's lots of the real thing as well in Spalding, that's been accumulated in by sources here and there. An awful lot of the old wagons disappeared at the end of wagon time, 50s, 60s, out of gypsy hands, and have been redeemed by being brought up little by little and restored to what they would have been like. But the smaller ones quite often made by people in prison, just because they had the time. But again, that whole issue about craft and about saying who you are. And the desperately sad thing with some of these people who are in for long term is that, you know, those were the only wheels that were going to take them anywhere, and that was to the far side of themselves. But for Gordon, when you go around the museum, it is very much not just the Museum of Gypsy Culture, it's the Boswell Museum, which is logical because he came from a highly respected family. The Boswells go back genealogically to mid 17th century, you know, almost within 100 years of the arrival. So you're reaching a point, and this of course is a great falsehood about the anthropological models of gypsy culture, which in the interest of kind of stress the present, lose that deep connection with the past, which is what drives people. So everywhere there are photos of the ancestors, everywhere there are the old stories, it takes you right back. And of course, it's a direct line, which is passed down in memory at the same time that you've got the resources of literacy backing it up. Yet at the same time, you get broken lines where you're dependent on the outside perception. This is Charlotte Stanley, a beautiful gypsy. I love the way it comes with a beautiful gypsy, like as opposed to any, no, never mind. So you've got her recorded in the 1820s. She was New Forest. From the same line of Stanley's, in fact, that was connected with a fellow called James Crabb, who wrote one of the first English books about gypsies. Of course, he was trying to convert everybody by methods that varied from the evangelical to the distinctly underhand. One of his favourite tricks was to say, I can do better for your children than you can, which in the case of Charlotte's family, Patience married Francis proudly. Francis was hanged for horse theft. Well, theoretically for horse theft, essentially for being a gypsy who'd stolen a horse, because the Gordon who'd stolen a horse as well got let off, but they decided to hang the gypsy. That, to be fair, was what motivated James Crabb to do something about his history of the people. And he got in with Patience and said, well, you know, I can do better for your children, and took little Vanslow and Elizabeth back home with him. And oh, there's lovely descriptions, like, you know, they're terrified of living in a house because they thought the ceiling was going to fall on them, all that kind of thing. And they died of smallpox. Oh dear, yes. It's which he regarded as, well, at least they went to heaven. There are ambiguities in the emotional relationships behind the people that he talks to. What fascinated me there, though, when I came to kind of do the linkages, is that, of course, Crabb doesn't tell you who anyone is. He just says, I was at Winchester Assizes, and I saw a man, you know, who was going to be convicted. And then afterwards, I met up with his about-to-be widow. But because we know what happened at Winchester Assizes, I was able to get in touch with Gary Stanley. And Gary, for a while, I mean, he's had his ons and offs, but was running one of the best gypsy history websites. And of course, Gary came out with who everybody is. So we've now got the details of all the people, which we can match up. And this is a struggle with gypsy history. You've got your sources, but you can never trust them until you do some joining up with the genealogical data, because that's what actually brings the family together. And Charlotte herself was educated. I mean, the reason why we've got, you know, the elegant picture is that she was educated by a local lady who took a shine to her, took her out of the community, again, like Elizabeth and Vanslow, and then kind of, oh, how wonderful, you know, polite. And of course, the issue here is that gypsies self-identifying with the aristocracy rather than the working class, whatever the material circumstances of their life to an outsiders, they were of a breed that was better than the people whom they saw every day, and they knew it, could take to gentry life without any difficulty. In fact, one of the other Stanley descendants actually went off and became a countess. Charlotte had offers of marriage from a high-born gentleman, and it was her benefactor's deep sorrow that she turned her back on him when she reached her 20s, walked out of the house and went back to the tents, where she married another gypsy and stood by him in thick and thin after he was convicted and put on the hulks, and looked after him when he came back into the New Forest again. So where is romance and where is reality in the projection of gypsy history? I mean, you look at this image. The Wagon Incident is perfectly reliable because it's actually taken from an 1874 photo. I recognise that one. The lady in the front comes straight out of the Catherine Cookson School of Romantic Heroines. And it's a wonderful up and down story of her travails, and you're kind of going, ooh, okay, is this being written? I mean, generally speaking, you know, the Catherine Cookson market, the emblematic lady in the foreground of the picture, has been a good one for gypsy paperbacks. Until you actually check the background facts, and you discover that not only is that the subject of Frances Brown's novel, is also a great-great-great-grandmother, because that is Liddy Gowan, Liddy Reynolds, in fact, who was, well, the story goes that she was the vicar's daughter and she was walking down the high street in Newell Fair, and she saw Chewbacca Matthews, who was James when he wasn't Chewbacca, stripped to the waist. Yes, I know, but we must imagine a handsome young lad in the boxing booth rather than the other Chewbacca, and then doing his bit as a all-comers fighter, and looked at him and said, "That's the man for me." And that was handed down through 5 generations. What happened is that we then realized, when you actually do the genealogy, of course there are lots of Matthews around, the ironic thing is that Francis comes from the showman side, because James had 5 sons, 5 children, and one of the sons, Redshirt, was probably the most successful one, who actually invested in the newly available showman's equipment. So he got himself a set of gallopers, at which point, mysteriously, he transmuted from being a gypsy into a showman, because he could get kind of better bookings that way. I mean, he still left patrons by the roadside to show where he'd been, and he still drank out of Crown Derby, and he still settled all of his arguments by the adroit use of a horsewhip, but he was now a showman. Whereas Charlie kept up the gypsy line. Of course, Charlie's descendants sort of kind of pushed this one back a little bit and said, well, I think you'll actually find, if you look at them in the census, there they are. And we've actually got Liddy, not, I have to say, a vicar's daughter. That was a slight improvement to the story, but accurately portrayed otherwise in the family narrative. And I've learned to, you know, not even raise an eyebrow when people turn their family. I mean, somebody pulled that picture on their phone. Again, how many people in the outside community carry their remote ancestors everywhere with them on a picture on their phone, and said that's my grandmother's grandfather. And I said, yeah, but that's Gilderoy Scamp. He's like one of the iconic 19th century gypsies. He was her grandmother's grandfather. I found that out when I started looking into it. So you got to look with a cautious eye about the things that have been thrown together. You've also got to respect traditions. I put these together partly because they illustrate the, you know, culture used by gypsies rather than gypsy culture. This is what they call bricolage. You've got here a whole load of essentially swag, lucky charms. You can tell they're lucky because you're lucky if you succeed in selling one of them, I suppose. Which Bob Dawson, who is a great accumulator of gypsy culture in all directions, wonderful, wonderful collection, which he's given to, well, on loan and to be finalised as a gift to the Museum of English Rural Life. All except the one at the top right, which was not commercial, was actually given to him by Henry Lee up in Spalding. And it was in Parktown where Bob was young, well young then. He started this collection as a teenager, and he was very much on his uppers. You know, a good meal would have set him up, and he knew he had an introduction to Henry, so he asked where the gypsy quarter was, and you know, actually asked a policeman. It's a bit dodgy because the policeman said, "Oh, well, you know, you go there, they'll cut your throat." But Bob kind of decided he didn't have many chances, so he was waiting outside Henry's to see if anyone was going to come out and cut his throat. And Henry came out instead and gave him supper. And then Henry said, well, look, you know, seeing you're interested in all this stuff, why don't you have a look at some of my mum's old jewellery? You know, have a look. I've got to go out and do some stuff, but I'll be back. And Bob just sat there and looked at it, didn't even move. And he said afterwards to me, well, yeah, but, you know, the only thing that happened is there's a funny sort of, as if the flap of the letterbox had been lifted and then dropped again. And then 15 minutes later, back comes Henry, looked at the pile on the table and said, well, you're honest, aren't you? He passed the test. And for that, he got given that horseshoe at top right. And the horseshoe wore it for ages, obviously. It was noticeable that when he was talking to people, you know, he'd sort of move his coat a little bit to one side. They you know, it would catch their eyes. And they go, oh, you know somebody, don't you? The classic museum statement, I suppose. Every object tells a story. But then again, this is another item. As I said, Bob is the most Catholic of collectors. So that here you have one of his, I suppose now you talk about it, the cultural perception of the gypsy. Mystic jigsaw puzzle, I love that, as opposed to an ordinary secular jigsaw puzzle. This is the gypsy as projected. And you're thinking, well, you know, does this really belong? Because obviously you're not going to extract any facts out of that. We're at the very furthest range of fantasy. Yes, we are, but it's an important remember that identity to yourself is an important part of who you are. Most communities have a self-identity, if you like, and then there's kind of how other people also perceive you. The English are notorious for understatement and lining up in queues, and the English do, in fact, to a certain extent, understate themselves and line up in queues. But the cliches other people have about you are false. Natural sense of rhythm, all that sort of thing. For a Gypsy perspective, because you're a people living in and off, essentially, your relationships with the host community, and have been for 500 years in this country, you also have to project a Gypsy myth to those people to make a living. And this is what fortune telling, dukkering, is about. This is the bit where you have to give people the impression that you can tell the future because they will give you lots of money, and that will enable you to have a future. And this has been going on. I mean, ever since the arrival. The first source we have in 1515 is a record of a Gypsy lady who could tell wonderful things by looking at your palm. And you know, you realize the ambiguity here of the power relationships with the host culture, that obviously, from many perspectives, Gypsies are at the receiving end of power. People get moved on, people get disregarded, people get worse service in health, people get worse service in law, and so on. But every now and then, the tables are turned. It's not pure subjection, because situations like dukkering, the Gypsy is the one in power. You take people's hats, and you've got that kind of electric personal collection, and you can start telling them a whole load of taradiddles. And for the moment, you're in the driving seat. And this became a kind of classic thing. This engraving here is taken from a now lost picture, which was on display in Boxall Gardens in the 1740s. And it's not tea leaves. This is a little bit too early. I think this is coffee grounds, but you get the same general principle. This is the art of divination from what's left in the cup. And it is very much, again, visual cliche. And you're screaming, this is not actual Gypsies. This is the perception of the Gypsy. Well, up to a point, there is a dialogue with reality going on there. Because if you read these pictures, as you're supposed to, if you know what's going on, the old Gypsy woman has infiltrated herself into a female circle. They're having their best silverware out there. And the young gentleman behind the tree, who is actually supposed to be invisible, has got his eyes in more senses than one on one of the girls. And the Gypsy is in fact forecasting a narrative which will twine the two of them together. And that is not fantasy. That was actually recorded. The great Southern English Gypsy Centre used to be at Norwood up until a series of violent enclosure acts, violently enforced enclosure acts, which between 1796 and 1807 effectively evicted the community. But one of the steps before the final act was actually a prosecution by the Society for Reducing Vice in 1804, who obviously tended to reduce the kind of vice practiced by poor people who couldn't afford lawyers, who hauled up 5 women in front of quarter sessions for fortune telling, but specifically for doing a deal whereby if young girls came out from London with their boyfriend, the two of them would be taken to one side and a glorious story would be spun of how the two of them were destined for each other. Their stars were intertwined, and by the way, they could book a room in the Gypsy House pub that afternoon for the two of them for a very reasonable rate. Mostly everybody apologised profusely and said they'd never meant to do anything like that, apart from Pentevenny Lovell, who poor dear had actually exchanged. This is the danger you see about being literate. You can understand why people had double views on it. She'd exchanged a letter with a young man saying that she would make a young girl subservient to all his desires, which with, many a South London girl cannot be too difficult. So one is inclined to feel that Pentevenny was acting as a matchmaker, but the court didn't quite see it that way, and she got 5 months hard labour. And yet, the trade continued. This is a picture by Laura Knight, the great portraitist of Gypsies, from the Derby, late 1830s. And it's the girls descending. I mean, obviously, they kind of figured that Dame Laura had got this pretty well sussed, but they would stop for a bit, and they would pull out you carried those little crystal balls in your pocket, because at that point, fortune telling was still illegal. So the policeman could get you for it if they spotted everything around you. Otherwise, you just walk through the crowd. And this is a bit where, I mean, the sources that we've got, and to some extent, this feeds over into costume and so on. Some of the material from a museum point of view that you are used to getting from previous generations is not going to be available when you're doing gypsies. Costume, classically, because costume is personal, and personal goods. I mean, there used to be all sorts of spots where, you know, people would pull up after a death and burn all the clothing. I mean, now it goes to Oxfam, and who minds how unlucky said stuff is at Oxfam for people who get it. But getting rid of it was crucial. You're not going to get an old headscarf, certainly not one that's got personal associations. What you've got to work from then are pictures like this, with Kathleen Lee at the left there, Melanie Lee in the middle. So Melanie has got the classic gypsy look. Melanie's cousin Rose on the right hasn't, but they've all got the kind of working uniform of the Dukera. So the idea about those bright headscarves and everything was not just that, you know, it helped impress people, but also that people could pick you out in the crowd as you made your way. And if you were older, you carried your baby slung around you, because you got a little bit of sympathy as well out of that. And you could, you know, and people would stop and say, what a lovely baby. And then you had the beginnings of the personal contact. But the other interesting thing about this, and this is what I mean about the need to join up sources. I saw Melanie in an earlier photo, about 1931, with Kathleen next to her, again photoed on the downs with her father, Drury Lee. But the caption says, hang on, you know, this is Drury and his two girls, but one of them isn't a gypsy girl, she's adopted. And in the end, contact was actually made with Kathleen, who said, yeah, no, I was, you know, a girl at loose end, and Darkest Price, my grandmother and Drury, my dad, adopted me and took me on the road. She had no objection to it at all. This, of course, is the flip side of the myth of the gypsy theft of babies, looking after unwanted teenagers in a day when family boundaries, and there were no social services, family boundaries were much looser. And you've also got families taking in neglected members of their own relatives in order to look after them. That was the accepted custom and seems to have done a great deal more good than harm. So the problem always with these stories, if you take the source one at a time, it's just a picture by Laura Knight. And you're kind of going, oh, that's very interesting, there were gypsies at the Derby. If you actually start to trace it together, and genealogy is the golden thread, family in any kind of gypsy history does the work of business, does the work of location, does the work of governance. Everything has to be mediated through, ultimately, who's related to whom. Oh, yes. I was going to say you can extract factual information from almost every image, but I think I may be pushing it a bit with this one. The only thing I love about this is it's a Thelwell cartoon. And Thelwell, you know, is interesting actually that Thelwell has got the wagon pretty well done. He could do a vehicle. Usually, you know, anybody who tries to do gypsies fails at the first hurdle, which is drawing a wagon with all the bits in the right places. I also love the misapprehension there with that dancing. You ever actually see step dancing? The art of step dancing is to move your feet as little as possible. But the music, of course, is real. And this is Harry Fiddle Player Lee, who actually appears in the census as the fiddle player. He put himself down as a trade. He earned his, I mean, he'd just go on the roads just with his boss and make money out of busking. He also had the great advantage, which not all of us do, that I mean, Sarah Ann is looking up adoringly at him and was prepared to look adoringly at him for several photos, which not all wives are prepared to do. So Harry, who has the dark look of the Lees, was distinctly photogenic. But the fiddle, as an item of iconic gypsy culture, obviously, like there was the, I mean, Harry's grandson, Ambrose, son of Louis, the girl at the right. Ambrose has gone over onto guitar, but is still, you know, well known for some of his songs. Again, they circulate only in the community. Arts which were once commercial, the whole point about playing the fiddle is that you got to play for non-gypsies dancing. So, you know, there were gypsy tents. Gypsy Stevens actually ran in the late 18th, early 19th century, monster booths, 60 feet long, with couples dancing up all the lengths of them. In the same way that storytelling, which was originally a money-making enterprise, was carried on down one family genealogy, the woods of North Wales, because it had become a marker of identity in the community. So the adoption of things, and so many gypsy things come from the outside. I mean, even wagons were essentially primarily invented by the chauffeur and taken up by the gypsies. That's how cultures form themselves. That's the classic bricolage of how you get things together. So outside perceptions, how viable are they? This is another of the classic 30s artists. This is Alfred Munning's Gypsy Life, convenient title. And you're kind of going, well, it contains a large number of cliches. The point is, of course, that these are not just romantic cliches as perceived from the outside. These are, the icons that are approved of by the community. The wagon, of course, is desirable as such. The horses are desirable as such. So are the outfits. Moocher Gregory on the left there with the chutney. Mark Stevens, I think, on the horse. Mark Stevens on that horse was actually adopted and is now the logo of the Romany and Traveller Family History Society. Mark's wife Comfort on the right and her sister Ocean. We know all of this, not because Munnings ever wrote it down. As far as Munnings were concerned, it was just, hail fellow, well met, but because these images were passed down in the family. And we've got one precious bit of evidence, which Nell Lover, which appears in one of the other pictures, actually writes to him saying, "Dear Mr. Money," I think that may have been a deliberate variation on Mr. Munnings. "Thank you for the money that I got for posing for your picture. I went out and got myself an orange scarf because you said orange went so well with my hair." So there's a dialogue between source and people that transcends, and I've read lots of stuff on Munnings, none of whom ever actually bothered to tell you who the people are in the picture or what they're doing, but all of which is much, much more fascinated in the, the gypsy as a Victorian bohemian icon, which doesn't really cut the mustard for me. On the other hand, the gypsy is a useful fellow to have at your open day. This is one of the leads, and we had him on the lawn at Bourne Hall. And look at the lad. I mean, he's in total control of that horse. He did rides all day, going round and round on the lawn. The ability of gypsy children from a very early age to be essentially totally self-sufficient is one of those features which the community has retained and will retain as long as it's a micro community. A world in which children grow up because they want to be like other gypsies and not because they want to be like other children is going to impart a skill set which carries the traditions down with you. And amongst those skills, of course, are the crafts, which are the things that generate a lot of the material that we're used to ending up in our museums. Now, the whole crafts thing fascinates me because the early history of it is largely lacking. You'll get the occasional journalist who falls over people while they're doing things. This is 1874 again. It's called The Road to the Derby. And as far as the general level of reliability is concerned, I told you they always got the wagons wrong. Look at the wheels on that one. I mean, you couldn't turn anything with wheels on the side like that. Couldn't do anything. Look more like water wheels. I'm not entirely too happy about the way that she's cutting up that food a bit too near to her clothing, but that's another issue about gypsy manners that obviously wasn't being picked up. But the doll is absolutely real because the custom, 1870s to 1890s, was that goers, race goers to the Derby, would put a little jointed doll in the hat band of their hats if they were men for luck. And so, like anything, there was an absolutely ready sale. Of course, the great thing about anything made out of wood, wood grows even in the outskirts of London. All you had to do was to harvest it, usually early in the morning when nobody noticed that you were appropriating it, and turn it into the dolls, and you were there. So wherever people wanted something in almost industrial quantities, I mean, for years and years, all the butchers' skewers in London used to be made by gypsies because they were stopping, in the woods. It was just a simple matter to get the wood, shape it up. Kids could do it, so the whole family could operate as a production line, taking the bark off and shaving them down. The wages were appalling. The takings were appalling. You got enough to live for 1,000 of them in a day. Think what that's like. But the principle by which you converted the woodland, if you like, into crafts was one of the fundamental ways of earning a living. And of course, the tool set come down to this. These are two peg making knives from Bob Dawson's collection. So this is the sort of thing, and everybody will have gypsy clothes pegs because they were sold in huge numbers. They warp a little bit after a while, so you've got to sell new ones. That's the whole point of the craft as a manufacturer. Tom, I think, made these just also to demonstrate that they've been knocked up from scratch, you can see. but to demonstrate not just these are what we use, but this is why you use it. The whole point about a penknife is that's to be as sharp as possible, because you're cutting your hazel about thick as your thumb, and you've got to cut it with a single blow from a mallet through the wood. So on a sharp knife, the flowers you make, and you want a knife that's as blunt as possible. The behind stage aspects of making these things is what you don't get. The kind of chain of activity that turns family life, and pegs, again, used to be made absolutely by a production scale. You had to boil them, you had to strip off the bark, you had to halve them, you had to mouth them, you had to put a little bit of tin around them, and each member of the family usually got given part of that job. You see what I mean about family being the route that takes you out of the objects and into history. But again, talking to family, of course, we have this kind of stuff, you know, in the case, assorted pegs. In fact, got a couple of flowers made by Jasper Smith, the great Jasper of the Gypsy Council, the folk singer, cousin of Sarah Ann that we saw in the earlier photograph. Jasper's father, Derby, was the brother of Albert Bulbred, that was Sarah Ann's father. And, you know, there they were doing absolutely no harm in a museological sort of way, and family come round. You know, usually there's a sort of particular quality of conversation that makes me put down whatever I'm doing and go out and introduce myself in the gallery. And this turned out to be young Caleb, and said, well, you know, my mum's died. I said, your mum? He said, yeah, Rachel. And I'd known Rachel in you know, her later years. But ironically, if you like, during my source delving, I'd actually come across a diary written from late 20s, early 30s, by somebody who knew the entire Smith clan. Jasper, Minty, who's famous for appearing in Topic Records, Levy sang as well, and young Rachel. And then, so almost like, you know, I knew the Rachel in a home, still beautiful, black hair, you know, bright eyes, losing a bit, worried if, you know, we thought she was still low, but still remembering everything, and you had to start talking wagons and things, and it came back again. But I also knew Rachel, the child, from the sources, dancing cock of the north on the doorstep and full of life, and Rachel was gone. And I said, yeah, you know, what do you want to do? And he said, well, look, just let me have a look at everything. And in fact, the photo is her in her wagon with young Henry and the rest of the family. And that was part of the display. And I said, yes, of course, you know, we're trustees, have a copy of the photo. And Caleb simply went away and came back a bit later and said, oh, that stuff you got in the case. Yeah, you know, I did that. I did the flowers. I did the little baskets you make out of putting the twigs together for each other. Did the Boxall and Rogers, the lucky flowers, did the pegs. And then they put it all, you know, where you have the floral traditions and everything at the grave. Just as well as that, you had the material culture, if you like, which isn't any longer stuff in the museum case, but which is actually part of grief and memory for somebody who was very, very important to us. And I'm running a little bit into time, and I know there's lots of people who, you know, have said they want to ask questions. So I think if it's okay, I'll stop screen sharing. And perhaps if we invited a few questions.
Yeah, sure. So if anyone has questions, two ways. You can either put your hand up and we'll get to you, or put it in the chat and I'll ask you to unmute yourselves. So we do have one question from someone who asked us on Eventbrite, and apologies if you are out there. The question is, we often talk about local audiences, but what does local mean to GRT communities? So do we need to collaborate across museums to make space to tell stories which may have moved across different locales?
Yes and no. There's, well, since the early days, there's been two traditions in travelling. There's been long travellers who just do the whole country and will cover the length and breadth of England. Usually, if it's somebody who's got a skill that will play anywhere. The danger about that, because you know, people tend to think when you talk about the road, there is still a slight cliche, the freedom of the road, because the road isn't free if you don't know it. So if you're a little bit cautious, reliant, you become a short traveller, and your circuit will be a county or two. So in fact, you'll be very close to the kind of local authority areas that we're used to. And I'm thinking, you know, generally speaking, the less income people had, the shorter their circuits. There's people like the Singing Gobies who were recorded by the early folk song collectors, who really were doing like an area 10 miles round in Surrey. I mean, 10 miles is about what you can do in a day in a wagon. You know, you don't think about it until you realise what the alternatives are. Dominic Reeve, who wrote the classic trilogy of books on travel and life in the 60s and 70s, he's really kind of like a West of England man, Hampshire, Dorset. And he stops one day and the fella pulls up. This is all these sort of courtesies between, you know, finding space, you know, the two of you in the same field. But he gets talking to the fella, and he's from Surrey, and he's totally lost and scared in a strange country. Generally speaking, again, you think of yourself as being independent of the settled people, yes, but some kind of knowledge, always going back to the same farm to do the picking, you know, always having the same people who buy stuff, something like scrap, knowing where the yards are, you are pinned into a geography. So the answer to that, I think, is that if you know, once you start knowing, you'll find, and some people, of course, move entirely from one country to another, one part of the country to another, you know, for whatever reasons, if something goes wrong. I mean, the classic bit on the census is when you find a family in one county, and then 10 years later, you find a completely different family, county, all with the same first names, all the children the same ages, but mysteriously with a different surname. How could that possibly have happened?
Thank you. Rebecca and Nicole, you've got your hand up. Are you able to unmute yourself and turn on your video?
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello. I was a little bit intrigued by a phrase you were using at the beginning a couple of times. I can't remember it exactly, but you were talking about something like in the time before it all went wrong. Something like that, and I wondered if you could just explain a little bit what you meant by that.
Yes, the nostalgia. Well, there's you know, there have been levels of nostalgia, and the community's had its up and downs. Wagon time is perceived as lasting from 1870s to the 1930s, and there is no doubt that during that period there was mounting police harassment. There's been a very interesting history written by a fellow called Alan Wright, specifically about Victorian Surrey and the arrangements there by which, up until about 1900, 1910, there had been free movement of gypsies, mainly because the then chief constable, a fellow called Mowbray Sant, was wonderful at putting his feet down. There may or not be historical analogies going on there, in saying, look, I've got plenty enough to do, you know, I'm trying to run a police force, I'm trying to keep down serious crime. Here you are telling me to keep moving people off the side of the road. I'm not telling my men to do that. It's trespass, which in those days was a civil offence, and you can leave it up to the landowners. I'm not the paid servant of the Lords of Manors. And Mowbray, up until the 20s, kept some of the pressure off. There were other issues, which was in Surrey more than anywhere else, but probably you'd be talking about similar situations north of London, in the outskirts of the big cities. The pressure on inner city commons like Wandsworth and Wimbledon, where people were being evicted as part of the programme of making these into kind of nicely maintained spaces, you know, surrounded by villa houses, pushed people into areas where there was much less living. So Surrey had a kind of classic area, the Hurtwood, which is actually on Surrey sand, it's pine forest, it's not really got anything you can work with, but which became this almost like secondary community, who of course really didn't have enough, you know, local trade to make a living. So they're out essentially, you know, mugging, begging from people to get by and causing all sorts of community tensions. So there's a, you know, a golden age as perceived by people, 1870s plus. The second golden age, and again, if you look at the books by the Victorian writers, lasted up until the 1824 Highways Act, when the mechanism of harassment was much weaker, mainly because, you know, there is at that stage no police force. The parish constable is the guy who has charges of moving. You only had to move over a parish boundary, And there's a glorious bit, the Gypsy Ring in Wimbledon, which is actually the boundaries of Wimbledon, Putney and Roehampton, where people just used to go round in a circle. They moved from Wimbledon to Putney and round again every time anybody who seemed to be a man in authority turned up trying to move you on. And after a while, they stopped bothering. So the perception, again in the 19th century, was that that had been one of those carefree moments. Yes, what the historian does with that, of course, you know, again, what you think about as nostalgia and what you think out, I mean, genuinely, historically, there have been ups and downs. Gypsies got away with more in terms of self-defense as a community in certain periods than others. There was actually a gunfight with the police on Epsom Downs in the 1830s, which was only terminated when the landlord of the rubbing house actually sided with the gabbers and started shooting at everybody from an upper window. You wouldn't get away with that these days.
I think following on from that, I've got a slightly selfish question, so I apologise. How do you see museums collecting Gypsy traveller material culture that relates to kind of current day? I mean, I know in Scotland we've had some discussions about the idea of museums collecting caravans as opposed to bow tents.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you see that happening down your way.
You have to have the resources for it. Gordon actually was collecting early trailers. He's got a lovely 1920s one and was just starting to move up. If you look at the website, I think it's called Cultivadas or something, but look, you know, you Google for gypsy wagons and you will see the extent to which property is moving around. And your then issue is, can you afford to take it out of its circulation into a museum? There is some fairly high-end stuff there. So you are talking now about, you know, historical works of art and paying the price for that rather than what you might have been able to get away with. And obviously, in a way, most of the people who collected wagons were doing it in the 60s, 70s, when they could get them for next to nothing. Ordinary material culture, you know, the acquisition of lucky flowers is not a problem. You just have to go in the right place and you know, attempt to make sure you're giving people folding money. Your problem then with all of that is that you're a recipient, of course, you know. I think in some ways, perhaps, you know, this is personal. I would have said build up your relations first. And also, it is also true that the one gap, you know, contemporary culture, yes, but it will be around for a while. Photos with memories is what's lost with every generation. So the oral history and the embodied oral history in photos is almost more important than the objects. If you want the objects, there is no harm in simply getting them replicated. Everybody who does fairs and so on will generate those for you. I mean, as I say, I've got Jasper's flowers, which are dear to me, not because they're an example of a craft, but because he made them for me. In fact, he's showing me how to do them and explaining that if the bottom ever fell out the museum business, I needed to have a kind of second string to my bow. There are issues there again about how moral is it to push that attitude of archiving the personal effects of the dead when that is in a sense improper. I think, you know, tools have a very different status from personal things. You know, get the boiler, get the kettle iron, because that's useful. I mean, I've known people who said that, you know, oh yeah, you know, got a kettle iron. That's been in my family ever since the time of the Hadley Bridge disaster, which is what, 1880s. So if something like that comes your way, and generally speaking, all of the Gypsy museums, if you like, the Gypsy run museums, Spalding is the only one now surviving. They tend to have their ups and downs, but all of them have accumulated a lot of that kind of material.
Thank you. I know we are at 4 o'clock now, but we do have one more question. Dee, are you out there and you're able to unmute yourself and show your, turn your camera on? If not, I can ask your question myself.
Yeah, I think Dee's got a rather bad connection.
So Dee has asked in the chat, what can we do to preserve the future history of the Gypsy Roma travellers? How can we support? So how does the wider community build relationships with the Gypsy Roma traveller community?
In a way, there's two parts, isn't there? There's the integration of Gypsy history into majority history. And there has been, Raphael Samuel did some great work on that when he was writing about London, in which the travellers were simply another aspect of London employment, the annual April exodus. So that's valuable. And I think everywhere that has even the passing relations, you know, people turning up and working a fair, putting the message out that, yes, they were there, you know, try and find out a little bit more, do your work, you know, on the baptisms, turn cliches into names is very important. But for working on it further, I think what we've tended to find in Surrey, I mean, you know, for many years we've been very fortunate support of the Surrey Rural Life Museum, the one at Tilford outside Farnham. We have created a weekend which has been a temporary anonymous reminiscence. It has actually given you a chance to create a Gypsy environment, and for actually communicating with people, that's what you want, because you've got to get people into the life until you give people a sense of what it feels like. And it's interesting because Violet Cannon up in Doncaster did an excellent Gypsy exhibition in Doncaster Town Hall Museum. It was on the marble floor, if you like. She'd actually got a bit of artificial grass and put up a bender tent on it insofar as he could without making holes in the marble. You see where this is going. Objects were in cases. I was fascinated because, you know, she had pushed this as a validification of Gypsy history by putting it into a museum context. Whereas I suppose I'm slightly less, you know, the museum context lacks the prestige for me because it's every day. I'm fascinated by creating the life in a museum space. I mean, when we have a, you know, a chitty, it's on a real fire and it's cooking real food and people are really eating it. Again, this is very much a kind of broader thing, the living museum as against the museum collection. And of course, there are some things that by definition are temporary anyway, like bender tents. You know, you are not going to get the materials for a bender tent. All you're going to get is how to put one up. And it's great fun because we got one up at one of our open days. And in fact, non-Gypsy, quite interested in it. So we kind of went, well, look, you know, here's the hazel. I'd got the only bit that's difficult is getting the blackthorn pins boiled in fat. So I did that for him, but he went ahead with the rest of it. And he spent the entire day half putting it up and being interrupted by an elderly Gypsy who'd come up to him and say, "You're doing that all wrong, you need to do it like X," at which point he would obediently do it like X, be interrupted by another elderly Gypsy who'd turn up and say, "No, you're doing all that wrong, you ought to be doing it like Y." I think by the end, he'd actually ended up doing it the way he was going to build it in the first place, and everybody agreed on it, because every family had their own preferred style.
I think you have just very nicely I think this is what I've learned, certainly up in Scotland, is that every single family has a different way of doing things. So if you do one thing, you have to explain that it's one family's. We have one last question. I'm afraid, everyone, this is the last one for the session. I've got the lounge. Do you want to, sorry, I think I said your name wrong there, but would you like to ask a question, or has Jeremy just covered what you were going to ask?
He's just covered it.
Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to segue, if you guys don't mind, into saying that if you are a member of the Rural Museums Network, next month, to celebrate Gypsy Roma Traveller History Month, we are actually going to be discussing Scottish bow tents. So it's what the English call benders. Up in Scotland, we call them bow tents. So we'll be joined by Cathy Townsley McGuigan, who's from Auchendrane Township in Argyll, and she'll be discussing her family's way of putting up a bow tent. So if you're a member, you are more than welcome to join us for free for that in June. And as I said earlier on in the session, this is the last for this side of summer, but in winter, the Rural Museums Network is going to have 3 more seminars, one of which is going to be covering conservation and one of which is going to be discussing sustainability in rural museums. So if you're not a member yet, head to our website and you can learn how to join from £10 a year. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Jeremy, and we hope to see you in another session soon.
Thank you.